Welcome to Animal Uncovered, the podcast where we explore the most unbelievable life cycles in the natural world. From the moment life begins to the moment it ends, nothing is as simple as it seems. Somewhere in the dark heart of a northern river, where the current runs cold and the light barely reaches the riverbed, something stirs. It has been waiting here for years, buried in the soft sediment tucked among gravel and silt, hidden from every predator that has ever cast a shadow across the surface above. For most of its life, this creature has been invisible, patient in the way that only the ancient things are patient, not with purpose, not with anticipation, but with the simple, unthinking persistence of a life form that has been perfecting this exact strategy for nearly 500 million years. And now something has changed. The water temperature has shifted. Somewhere upstream the season has turned. The chemical signals carried in the current, signals too subtle for any human instrument to easily detect, but unmistakable to this creature, have triggered something deep and irreversible inside its body, a hormonal cascade, a biological alarm clock that has been ticking since the day it was born. It begins to move. It is not large, perhaps 40 centimetres, though some of its kind grow considerably longer. Its body is eel-like in shape, smooth, sinuous, limbless, built for exactly the kind of sinuous muscular movement it now employs as it wriggles free of the silt that has been its world. But look closely, and you will notice the differences that set it apart from any eel, from any fish you have ever seen. There are no paired fins. There is no jaw in the conventional sense. Where a mouth should be, there is instead a disc, a circular tooth-lined suction apparatus that looks, depending on your temperament, either like an engineering marvel or like something pulled directly from a nightmare. This is a lamprey, and what it is about to do, the journey it is about to undertake, the transformation it is about to undergo, is one of the most extraordinary stories in the entire animal kingdom. It will travel hundreds of kilometres upstream against brutal currents, using its sucker to cling to rocks and haul itself forward inch by inch. It will stop eating entirely. Its digestive system will actually dissolve and disappear inside its own body, replaced by developing reproductive organs. It will push itself to the absolute limit of what living tissue can endure, and when it finally reaches the gravel spawning beds where it was born, it will reproduce and it will die. And in dying, it will feed the forest, enrich the river, and seed the next generation. But that's only the end of the story. The beginning is stranger still. Part 1. Why this animal matters. There are creatures in this world that earn their reputation honestly, and then there are those who are misunderstood, condemned by appearances and circumstances into roles they never quite deserve. The lamprey sits in an uncomfortable position somewhere between both of those categories. Ask most people what they know about lamprey, and you will get one of two responses. The first is a shudder, followed by some variation of "isn't that the thing with the horrible teeth?" The second, particularly from anyone who spent time near the Great Lakes in North America, is an expression of pure exasperation. Because there, the sea lamprey has become synonymous with ecological catastrophe, an invasive species that very nearly destroyed one of the world's great freshwater fisheries. Both of those reputations contain truth, but they obscure something far more fascinating. The lamprey, all 41 or so species of it distributed across rivers and coastal seas on almost every continent, is among the oldest vertebrates alive today. Its body plan has remained essentially unchanged for so long that fossil lampreys found in ancient Cretaceous rock look startlingly similar to the ones swimming in our rivers right now. It has outlasted dinosaurs. It has outlasted entire ocean systems. It has survived every mass extinction this planet has thrown at life, and it has done so without evolving a jaw, without developing paired fins, without acquiring any of the anatomical accessories that we tend to associate with successful, adaptable fish. It did it by being brilliantly, ruthlessly itself. And its life cycle, that particular journey from egg to larva to adult, is so unusual, so physiologically dramatic, that it challenges some of our most basic assumptions about what an animal can be. The lamprey does not simply grow up, it transforms, it rebuilds itself from the inside out, not once but across multiple stages, each one so different from the last that early naturalists genuinely believed they were looking at different species. So the central question driving this episode is not merely what is a lamprey, it is something more profound. How does an animal that has barely changed in 500 million years continue to not just survive, but to genuinely matter? To rivers, to ecosystems, to the extraordinary web of life that depends on clean, cold, flowing water. The answer, it turns out, is written into every stage of its life. Part 2. Evolution and Origins. To understand the lamprey, you need to travel back in time. Not hundreds of years, not millions of years, but hundreds of millions of years. Back to the Ordovician period, roughly 450 million years ago, when the seas of this planet were populated by creatures so alien they barely register as familiar life forms at all. Vertebrates, animals with backbones, had only recently appeared on the scene. And in those early oceans they were not the dominant force. They were small, vulnerable, competing for space and resources among invertebrates that had been running the show for far longer. Among those earliest vertebrates were creatures called agnathons, jawless fish, and from that ancient lineage 2 groups survive to this day. One is the hagfish, the other is the lamprey. The split between these 2 lineages happened so long ago that it predates most of the evolutionary events we consider ancient history. Hagfish and lamprey share a common ancestor, but they parted ways before jawed vertebrates, the lineage that would eventually produce sharks, bony fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds and mammals, including us, even existed. This makes the lamprey not just an old species, but a window into a world before vertebrate life took its most familiar forms. The oldest definitive lamprey fossils date to around 360 million years ago, found in rocks from the Devonian period in places like South Africa and Montana. And here is the thing that stops paleontologists in their tracks. Those ancient lampreys are essentially identical to modern ones. The sucker disc is there. The eel-like body is there. Even the larval stage appears to be represented in the fossil record, which suggests that the complex multi-stage life cycle we're about to explore had already evolved hundreds of millions of years before the age of dinosaurs. This extraordinary conservatism, this refusal to change, is not laziness. It is evidence of something rarer and more valuable in evolutionary terms: perfection. When a body plan works so comprehensively, when it allows an organism to exploit its niche so effectively that no pressure accumulates to alter it, evolution simply doesn't. The lamprey found its formula and stuck with it, while the rest of the vertebrate world spun off into wild experimentation. Part of what makes the lamprey so successful from an evolutionary standpoint is precisely what makes it seem so strange to us. The absence of a jaw is not a limitation, it is a specialization. The lamprey's ancestors never developed jaws, and rather than being left behind by those relatives who did, they carved out their own ecological space. exploiting resources and environments that jawed fish either could not access or were not as well suited to dominate. The sucker disc that evolved in place of a jaw is, in many ways, a more versatile tool than a conventional fish mouth. It can grip, it can rasp, it can anchor. And in the parasitic species, it can do all of these things simultaneously to a host fish, maintaining a hold against powerful currents while feeding continuously. It is not pretty, but it is extraordinarily effective. The lamprey skeleton offers another glimpse into deep evolutionary time. Rather than bone, lampreys have cartilage, a softer, more flexible material that is also the primitive condition for vertebrates. True bone came later, as evolution layered complexity onto the basic vertebrate template. The lamprey never took that step, and its cartilaginous skeleton preserves something of what the earliest backboned animals looked like from the inside. Similarly, the lamprey's nervous system, its circulatory system, and its sensory apparatus are all simplified versions of what you find in more derived vertebrates, but simplified in the way that a clean, elegant original is simpler than a complex revision. Studying the lamprey nervous system has given neuroscientists remarkable insights into how vertebrate nervous systems in general are organized, because the lamprey's version is stripped down enough to study clearly without losing the fundamental architecture that it shares with every other vertebrate, including humans. This is a creature, then, that carries within it the memory of what all of us once were, and it is still very much alive. Part 3, the life cycle. Phase 1, the egg and the red. Every lamprey life begins in gravel. In the spawning season, which varies by species and geography but typically falls in spring or early summer, adult lampreys gather at carefully selected sites in the upper reaches of rivers and streams. What they are looking for is specific, clean, well-oxygenated water flowing over a substrate of small to medium-sized gravel, in areas where the current is strong enough to keep sediment from settling and smothering what will come next. When they find such a place, they build a nest, called a red, a term shared with salmon. But where salmon use their tails to excavate nesting hollows, lampreys use their suckers. They grip individual stones and move them one at a time, clearing and shaping a depression in the riverbed. It is painstaking, exhausting work for animals that are already at the very end of their physiological reserves, having migrated potentially hundreds of kilometers without eating, their internal organs in a state of progressive dissolution, and yet they do it with what can only be described as singular focus. Neighbouring pairs sometimes cooperate, contributing to shared reds in loose spawning aggregations. There is no aggression here, no competition for space in the conventional sense. The urgency is reproductive, not territorial. When the red is prepared, the female releases her eggs into the current while the male fertilizes them. A single female lamprey can produce somewhere between 1,000 and 200,000 eggs, depending on the species, a number that reflects the enormous attrition rate in the larval years to come. The eggs are tiny, adhesive, and they settle quickly into the spaces between gravel particles, where the water flow will keep them oxygenated during the weeks of incubation that follow. For the adults, there is nothing left to do. And so, with a simplicity that is almost poetic in its finality, they die. Their bodies, already depleted beyond recovery, drift downstream and decompose. In doing so, they return to the river the nutrients they absorbed during their parasitic feeding phase. Marine-derived nutrients rich in nitrogen and phosphorus that would otherwise never reach this far inland. A single spawning run of lampreys can measurably enrich the chemistry of an entire river reach, feeding algae, invertebrates, and ultimately fish. The lamprey's death is not an ending. It is a delivery. Phase 2, the amocoete. Depending on water temperature, the eggs hatch within 2 to 4 weeks, and what emerges from those eggs bears so little resemblance to the adult lamprey that early naturalists gave it a different name entirely, as amocoete, before realizing it was the same animal. The amocoete is small. Newly hatched, it is only a few millimeters long, translucent, worm-like, barely more than a thread of living tissue in the gravel. Its eyes are not yet functional. They exist beneath the skin, rudimentary, sensitive to light in only the most basic way. It has no sucker disc. It has no teeth. It does not even feed in the way the adult will feed. It is, in almost every meaningful sense, a completely different organism sharing genetic material with its future self. What the amocoete does, immediately and instinctively, is burrow. It wriggles down into the silt and fine sediment downstream of the red, away from the gravel, into the softer substrate of the riverbed. There it will stay, not for days, not for weeks, not even for months, but for years. Depending on the species and the richness of the environment, the larval phase of a lamprey's life can last anywhere from 3 to 7 years, and in some species and some cold, nutrient-poor streams, it can extend to as long as 10 years. 10 years buried alive. Inside its burrow, the amocoete feeds in a way that is completely unlike anything in its adult life. It is a filter feeder, a gentle, passive consumer of algae, bacteria, and organic detritus that it draws in with cilia-lined feeding apparatus. Water flows over a structure called the oral hood, which channels microscopic food particles toward a mucus-coated groove that transports them to the gut. It is a system more reminiscent of a mollusk or a sea squirt than a vertebrate. The amocoete does not hunt. It does not chase. It sits in its burrow and lets the river bring food to it. This is not the behavior of a primitive animal failing to develop more sophisticated strategies. It is an extraordinarily efficient way to exploit an abundant and largely untapped food source. The river's suspended organic matter, the invisible soup of bacteria, algae, and decomposed material that flows through every watercourse, is available in enormous quantities. The amocoete accesses it with minimal energy expenditure. In good habitat, amocoete populations can reach densities of hundreds of individuals per square meter of riverbed, all quietly filtering away, growing almost imperceptibly slowly in the cold water. Life underground is not without danger. Predatory invertebrates, the larvae of stoneflies, the nymphs of large predatory insects, can find and kill amocoetes. Birds like dippers, those remarkable small songbirds that walk along the bottoms of streams, will probe into sediment to find them. During floods, the disturbance of the riverbed can expose buried amocoetes and carry them into hostile conditions. And throughout these years, the quality of the water matters enormously. Amocoetes are sensitive to pollution, to siltation, to the fine sediment that agriculture and construction wash into rivers and that can fill the interstitial spaces where amocoetes breathe and feed, effectively suffocating their habitat. But for those that survive, and many do, these years in the sediment are a period of quiet accumulation. Slowly, steadily, the amocoete grows. It molts its cuticle as it increases in size. It develops internal organs. Its muscle fibers multiply. And somewhere in its biology, processes are ticking along that will, when the time comes, trigger one of the most dramatic biological transformations in the vertebrate world. Phase 3 Metamorphosis. There is no single event that precipitates it. Rather, a confluence of factors. The amocoete reach in a sufficient body size, subtle environmental cues, the internal accumulation of hormonal signals sets in motion a process that is as profound as anything in biology. Not just significant, but profound. Because what happens to a lamprey during metamorphosis is not merely the maturation of existing structures, it is the wholesale destruction and reconstruction of the animal's body. Over a period of roughly 3 to 4 months, occurring typically in late summer or autumn, the amacoet transforms into a juvenile lamprey. During this time, it does not eat. It cannot eat. Its feeding apparatus is entirely dismantled and replaced. Its intestine degenerates and is rebuilt. Its kidneys change their function radically, preparing the animal for a shift from fresh water to either the sea or large lakes, depending on the species. Its eyes, previously buried under skin and nearly useless, migrate to the surface and develop into fully functional visual organs. Its oral hood is replaced by the characteristic sucker disc, armed with keratinous teeth, arranged in precise species-specific patterns. Its gills restructure themselves. Even the chemistry of its blood changes. And through all of this, it continues to not eat. This is a physiological feat that has no close parallel in the vertebrate world. Metamorphosis in amphibians, the transformation of a tadpole into a frog, is dramatic. But it occurs in animals that continue to feed throughout much of the process. The lamprey undergoes a more complete remaking on energy reserves alone, sustained by the fat and protein it stored during its years as an amacoet. By the time metamorphosis is complete, the animal has consumed a significant portion of its own body mass. What emerges from this process is recognizably a lamprey in the adult sense. The sucker, the eel-like body, the 7 gill openings on each side that are one of the most reliable ways to distinguish a lamprey from an eel at a glance. It is now, depending on the species, either preparing for a parasitic feeding phase in open water or, in those species that are non-parasitic as adults, preparing simply to wait out the winter and spawn in spring. The division of lamprey species into parasitic and non-parasitic forms is one of the more remarkable facets of their biology and worth dwelling on for a moment. Among the world's roughly 41 lamprey species, about half are parasitic as adults and half are not. The parasitic species migrate to the sea or to large lakes after metamorphosis and spend their adult years feeding on the blood and body fluids of other fish. The non-parasitic species, often called brook lampreys, do not feed at all as adults. They emerge from metamorphosis, overwinter, spawn in spring and die, never having used the elaborate sucker disc for feeding even once. It exists purely as a reproductive tool, a means of anchoring to rocks during nest construction and mating. The two forms, parasitic and non-parasitic, are often closely related, sometimes sister species inhabiting the same river system. The non-parasitic forms are thought to have evolved from parasitic ancestors multiple times independently, which suggests that the non-parasitic strategy is a viable alternative rather than a degenerate one. In nutrient-rich environments where amacoets can accumulate enough energy reserves to reproduce without additional adult feeding, cutting out the parasitic phase entirely reduces the time and energy spent in dangerous open water and gets straight to reproduction. It is evolution being practical, and practical in this case is also elegant. Phase 4. The parasitic adult. For those species that do take the parasitic route, the months after metamorphosis represent a transition from the absolute stillness of larval life to something entirely opposite. Constant movement, constant feeding, constant navigation through vast bodies of water. Sea lampreys, perhaps the best studied species for reasons we will return to, migrate from their natal streams to the sea or to large lakes in winter or early spring. They are now fully functional visual hunters, capable of tracking prey over considerable distances. Their sucker disc is operational and loaded with intent. Their bodies are streamlined and powerful, capable of sustained swimming. Everything about them, every adaptation, every organ is oriented around a single objective: finding a host and feeding. The feeding behaviour of a parasitic adult lamprey is something that inspires genuine awe, albeit the uncomfortable kind. The lamprey locates a host fish, typically a large, slow-moving species, though lampreys are somewhat opportunistic, and attaches with the sucker disc. The seal formed by that disc is extraordinarily strong, capable of maintaining grip even as the host fish accelerates, turns, and attempts to dislodge the parasite. Once attached, the lamprey rasps through the host's scales and skin using its teeth, secreting an anticoagulant into the wound that keeps blood flowing freely and begins to feed on blood and body fluids. An attached lamprey can remain on a single host for days or even weeks. The wound it creates does not heal cleanly during feeding. The anticoagulant prevents it. After the lamprey detaches, either voluntarily when sated or when the host dies, the wound is often severe enough to be fatal, particularly in fish that were already weakened or that were unlucky enough to attract multiple lampreys. Not every host dies. Many survive a single lamprey attachment and go on to recover. The characteristic circular scar left by a lamprey's sucker disc is a relatively common sight in populations of large fish in lamprey habitat, and it speaks to encounters that ended with both parties surviving. The lamprey is not, in this sense, a strategically suicidal parasite. A host that dies too quickly is, in evolutionary terms, a wasted resource. And indeed, sea lampreys show a preference for large hosts, which have greater body mass to donate to the parasite's growth. During this feeding phase, the lamprey grows rapidly. A sea lamprey that enters the ocean or lake at perhaps 30 centimetres and 100 grams may, over 12 to 20 months of parasitic feeding, grow to 60 or 70 centimetres and several hundred grams. The energy it accumulates during this phase is what will fuel everything that follows: the migration back to fresh water, the construction of the red, the production of eggs or sperm, and the death. Phase 5. The final migration. At some point triggered again by hormonal shifts and environmental cues, the parasitic adult lamprey stops feeding. Something changes in its physiology, in its relationship to food. It is not simply that it becomes satiated. The drive to feed actually diminishes and eventually ceases, and simultaneously, the drive to return to fresh water, to find its spawning grounds, becomes overwhelming. What follows is a migration that, for its combination of physiological drama and navigational precision, deserves to be mentioned in the same breath as the great migrations of salmon, of sea turtles, of albatrosses. Lampreys navigate back to freshwater rivers using a combination of sensory cues, the chemical signatures of freshwater systems, the memory of the particular chemical fingerprint of their natal stream, possibly magnetic cues. They detect the outflow of their home rivers from considerable distances in the open ocean or lake, and they orient themselves accordingly. As they travel, their bodies change. The digestive system begins to degenerate. It will not be needed again. Fat reserves are mobilized. Gonads develop rapidly, filling space inside the body cavity that was previously occupied by functional digestive organs. The lamprey becomes, in a very real sense, a reproductive organism with a streamlined transport system, muscle, cardiovascular system, nervous system, gonads. Everything else is being stripped away. Entering the river, they push upstream with remarkable tenacity. The sucker disc, which evolved for feeding, now serves equally effectively as a climbing tool. In reaching rapids, lampreys attach themselves to rocks on the riverbed and inch forward, releasing, swimming briefly against the current, attaching again to the next rock. They can navigate around obstacles that defeat even strong swimming salmonids. Their low profile and flexible body allow them to find passages through weirs and barriers that bar other fish. But not all barriers can be overcome, and this matters enormously for their survival as species, as we will explore when we discuss conservation. The lamprey's upstream migration, its ability to reach suitable spawning gravel in the upper river, reaches where conditions are right, depends on unobstructed river channels. Block the river and you cut the lamprey off from its future. Part 4. Biology and Adaptations. To fully appreciate the lamprey, you need to spend some time with its anatomy. Not because it is grotesque, though it certainly challenges conventional notions of beauty, but because every feature tells a story about a different evolutionary solution to the challenges of vertebrate life. Begin with the sucker disc. In parasitic species, it is armed with a variable number of teeth, hard, keratinous structures that are not true teeth in the vertebrate sense, containing no dentine or enamel, but functional equivalents that serve the same rasping purpose. The arrangement of these teeth is species-specific enough that taxonomists use it to distinguish between lampreys that would otherwise look nearly identical. Some species have sharply pointed teeth arranged in concentric rows, others have blunter, more bicuspid forms. The inner surface of the disc is covered in papillae, small fleshy projections that help create and maintain the suction seal. The tongue itself is tooth-bearing, moving in a piston-like motion to rasp through the host's flesh. The anticoagulant secreted during feeding is a compound called lampredin in older literature, though research has since identified the key active molecules more precisely as proteins that interfere with the host's blood-clotting cascade. These secretions are extraordinarily effective, preventing the host's wound from sealing for the entire duration of attachment, and sometimes for hours after the lamprey detaches. This is not incidental chemistry. It is a precisely evolved biochemical weapon, tuned by millions of years of interaction with host fish immune and clotting systems. Move to the gills and you find another unusual arrangement. Most fish ventilate their gills by pumping water through the mouth and out over the gill surfaces, a one-way flow system that requires an open mouth. For an attached lamprey, the sucker disc occupies the oral opening, making conventional gill ventilation impossible during feeding. Lampreys have solved this elegantly. Their gill pouches are connected both to the throat and to external openings on each side of the body, allowing them to pump water in and out of the same opening simultaneously, oxygenating their blood even while the sucker holds fast to a host. It is a respiratory system redesigned for a very specific lifestyle. The lamprey's sensory biology is rich and complex. Vision is important to adult lampreys, and their eyes are sophisticated enough to detect colour, which matters for identifying host fish by the visual cues that distinguish them from other objects in the water. But it is the chemical senses that are most acute. Lampreys have an exceptional sense of smell, mediated by a single nostril on the top of the head, connected to an olfactory organ, that allows them to detect specific chemical compounds in the water at extraordinarily low concentrations. Critically, lampreys produce and respond to pheromones, chemical signals released by other lampreys. Adult males in spawning condition release a pheromone that attracts ripe females. Amacoetes release a bile acid-based compound that attracts spawning adults to suitable larval habitat, effectively a chemical signal that says, "This stretch of river works, come here." Researchers have identified and synthesized some of these pheromones, opening the possibility of using them as tools in both conservation and control programs. The lateral line system, a sensory system that detects pressure waves and movement in the surrounding water, is well developed in lampreys and gives them a kind of spatial awareness that supplements vision in murky water. They can detect the bow wave of a moving fish from some distance, which is useful both in locating prey and in navigating complex currents. Immunologically, the lamprey is extraordinary. It possesses an adaptive immune system, the ability to produce specific immune responses to specific pathogens, but it is built on completely different molecular architecture from the antibody-based system shared by all other vertebrates. Where jawed vertebrates use proteins called immunoglobulins as the basis of their antibody repertoire, lampreys use entirely different proteins called variable lymphocyte receptors. The two systems accomplish the same thing, a vast repertoire of specific molecular recognition, but they arrived at the solution independently, through convergent evolution. Studying the lamprey immune system has given immunologists a profound insight into what adaptive immunity looks like when it evolves from scratch, and has expanded our understanding of the minimum requirements for sophisticated biological self-defense. The lamprey's nervous system offers similar rewards to those who study it. The giant reticulospinal neurons of the lamprey, large, easily identifiable nerve cells that run from the brain into the spinal cord, have been used as a model system for understanding how vertebrate brains control movement for decades. Much of what we know about the basic organization of the vertebrate brainstem, about how signals from the brain translate into coordinated muscle activity, comes from work done on lamprey neurons. The animal that most people think of as a simple, primitive parasite has contributed significantly to human neuroscience. Part 5. Ecosystem Role. It is tempting and understandable to frame the lamprey primarily through the lens of its parasitic feeding, the scar-ringed host fish, the bloodied water, the drama of attachment and extraction. But to do so is to miss the vast majority of what the lamprey actually does for the ecosystems it inhabits. Start in the sediment with the Amacoetes. A healthy stream with lamprey larvae present contains millions of tiny filter feeders buried in the substrate, processing organic matter, cycling nutrients, and in the process binding sediment and preventing erosion of the stream bed. When Amacoetes are removed from stream sections experimentally, measurable changes in sediment chemistry and algal communities follow. These larvae are not inert passengers in the stream ecosystem. They are active processors, small but numerous enough to have real effects on the chemistry and biology of their habitat. Then consider the adults. Parasitic lampreys are, from the perspective of their host fish, predators, or more precisely host feeders, whose impact on the host population can range from mild to severe depending on lamprey density and host abundance. But even this interaction has ecological dimensions that go beyond simple predator-prey dynamics. Severely parasitized fish may die and sink to the bottom, contributing organic matter to the benthic community. Fish weakened by lamprey attachment may be more vulnerable to other predators, with cascading effects through the food web. And host fish populations kept in check by lamprey predation may, in turn, have reduced pressure on the prey fish they themselves eat. These dynamics are, admittedly, complicated to unravel in natural systems. But the principle is clear. The lamprey does not exist in isolation. It is part of a web, and pulling it out has consequences. The most significant ecosystem contribution of the lamprey, though, may be the one that happens at the very end of its life. When spawning adult lampreys die in the headwaters of rivers, they deliver marine-derived nutrients, primarily nitrogen and phosphorus, that the lamprey accumulated during its feeding phase in the sea or in large lakes, into river systems that are often nutrient-poor. This is exactly the same process that makes salmon spawning runs so famous for their ecological importance. A salmon carcass in a headwater stream feeds bears, eagles, and ravens. It feeds flies whose larvae fall into the water. It fertilizes the stream bank vegetation. It enriches the water chemistry enough to measurably improve the growth rates of juvenile fish for months afterward. Lamprey carcasses do the same thing, albeit with less theatrical packaging. Historically, in rivers that supported large lamprey populations alongside salmon runs, the combined nutrient input from both species represented an enormous subsidy to terrestrial and aquatic food webs that extended far from the river itself. The decline of lamprey populations in many rivers is not, therefore, simply a story about one species disappearing. It is a story about rivers becoming slowly and silently less fertile. There is also a more direct predatory relationship to consider. Numerous species eat lampreys at various life stages. Amocoetes are eaten by dippers, by herons, by larger aquatic invertebrates. Adult lampreys, particularly during spawning migrations when they're concentrated and exhausted, are taken by otters, by ospreys, by large predatory fish. In some coastal areas, harbour seals have been observed feeding on migrating lampreys. The lamprey is not only a consumer in these ecosystems, it is also a resource, a concentrated packet of energy and protein that supports a remarkable range of other wildlife. Part 6. Human Connection and Conservation. The human relationship with the lamprey is old, complicated, and in many ways instructive about the broader challenges of conservation and ecological management. Begin with the history. Lampreys have been eaten by humans for thousands of years. They were prized in medieval Europe, genuinely prized, not merely tolerated. Lamprey was considered a delicacy reserved for the wealthy and powerful, valued for its rich, fatty flesh and its unusual texture. Henry I of England is said to have died from a surfeit of lampreys, or as one contemporary source colourfully put it, by gorging on them against the advice of his physicians. Whether or not the lamprey truly killed a king, the story tells us something about how highly it was regarded. In parts of the Baltic, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, lamprey fishing remains an active, culturally significant tradition to this day. The river lamprey is caught in autumn, smoked or fried, and consumed as a seasonal delicacy. In regions of Spain and Portugal, lamprey in red wine sauce appears on restaurant menus in lamprey season, with the same anticipation that marks the arrival of truffles or asparagus in other culinary traditions. These cultural connections to lamprey represent something rare in conservation, a human relationship with a threatened species that is based not on fear or ignorance, but on genuine appreciation, even love, for the animal. But that positive relationship coexists uncomfortably with a very different story, one that unfolds primarily in North America. The sea lamprey is native to the Atlantic coast of North America, to rivers flowing into the Atlantic, and to Lake Ontario, which was historically accessible to migratory sea lampreys via the St. Lawrence River and Niagara Falls. The other Great Lakes, Erie, Huron, Michigan, Superior, were historically separated from sea lamprey populations by Niagara Falls, which lampreys could not ascend. The construction of the Welland Canal, first in 1829 and expanded multiple times thereafter, created a navigable bypass around Niagara Falls that connected Lake Ontario to Lake Erie, and that connection, unintentionally, opened the door for sea lampreys to colonize the upper Great Lakes. The colonization happened gradually through the early 20th century, accelerating from the 1930s onward, and it was catastrophic. The lake trout populations of the upper Great Lakes, which had never co-evolved with sea lampreys, and therefore had no behavioral or physiological adaptations to cope with them, collapsed under the combined pressure of lamprey predation and heavy commercial fishing. Lake trout had been commercially fished in the Great Lakes for over a century, and the stocks were already under stress. The sea lamprey pushed them over the edge. By the 1940s, lake trout populations in Lakes Huron and Michigan had effectively collapsed. The commercial fishery that had supported communities around the Great Lakes for generations essentially ceased to function. The ecological and economic consequences were severe and long-lasting. The response, a joint program between the United States and Canada, managed through the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, established in 1955, became one of the most intensive and sustained biological control programs ever attempted. The primary tool has been a chemical lampricide called TFM, which at carefully calibrated concentrations is toxic to amacoetes in their stream habitat, while being considerably less harmful to other aquatic life. TFM treatments of lamprey-producing streams have, over decades, reduced sea lamprey populations in the upper Great Lakes by roughly 90%. Combined with physical barriers to upstream migration, trapping programs, and increasingly the use of lamprey pheromones as attractants and disruptors, the program has allowed lake trout populations to partially recover and the fishery to partially revive. The Great Lakes Sea Lamprey Control Program is simultaneously a conservation success story and a cautionary tale. It demonstrates that intensive, sustained, science-based management can control an invasive species and allow damaged ecosystems to recover. But it also illustrates what happens when human infrastructure, a canal in this case, inadvertently connects ecosystems that evolution kept separate. The sea lamprey is not a villain in its native range. It is an ecologically important, evolutionarily ancient component of Atlantic coastal and riverine ecosystems. It became destructive only when transported beyond the biological context in which it evolved. In Europe, meanwhile, the lamprey faces an entirely different set of problems. Not too many, but too few. All three European lamprey species, the sea lamprey, the river lamprey, and the brook lamprey, have declined significantly over the past century. The causes are familiar from the broader story of river ecology: dams and weirs that block upstream migration, degraded water quality from agricultural runoff and urban development, siltation of spawning and larval habitat, and the general homogenization of rivers that accompanied intensive land use across the continent. Sea lampreys in particular have disappeared from many European rivers where they were historically abundant. In the rivers of England, Wales, Germany and France, populations that once supported commercial fisheries and ecological processes are now remnants, restricted to the cleaner headwaters and lower densities that remain accessible above what barriers haven't completely cut off passage. Conservation efforts in Europe have focused primarily on improving river connectivity, removing or bypassing obsolete weirs and dams, constructing lamprey passes at barriers that cannot be removed, and restoring degraded habitat. Lamprey-specific fish passes, designed to accommodate the sucker-climbing behaviour of migrating adults, rather than the leaping ability of salmonids, have been installed at a number of sites across the UK and Europe with encouraging early results. Where barriers are removed and water quality improves, lamprey populations show the capacity to recolonize relatively quickly, which suggests that the obstacles are largely physical and chemical rather than fundamental. The animal itself retains its resilience, its ancient capability for persistence, if only the barriers are cleared. The lamprey also faces an emerging challenge common to all cold water, oxygen-dependent species: climate change. Lampreys require cold, well-oxygenated water at virtually every stage of their life cycle. Warming river temperatures, reduced summer flows and increased frequency of drought reduce the habitat available to amacoetes and to spawning adults. The fine sediment problems that already threaten amacoete habitat are likely to worsen as extreme rainfall events become more frequent, flushing agricultural land and loosened soils into watercourses. The window of suitable thermal conditions for lamprey in many rivers is narrowing, and in some cases it is narrowing faster than conservation measures can counterbalance. In recognition of all these pressures, lampreys are now legally protected in many countries. In the United Kingdom, all 3 species are protected under the habitats regulations, making it an offence to deliberately disturb, injure or kill a lamprey, or to damage or destroy the habitats they depend on. The European sea lamprey and river lamprey are listed on Annex 2 of the European Habitats Directive, requiring EU member states to designate special areas of conservation for their protection. Similar protections exist in parts of North America for native lamprey populations outside the Great Lakes region. Indigenous communities in parts of the Pacific Northwest have long recognized the importance of Pacific lampreys, a distinct species from the sea lamprey of the Atlantic, and have advocated for their protection not only on ecological grounds but on cultural ones. Pacific lampreys have been harvested and eaten by tribal communities for thousands of years, used ceremonially and practically, and woven into the cultural identity of people whose connection to the river systems of the Northwest goes back to time beyond memory. For these communities, the decline of the Pacific lamprey is not merely a biological problem, it is a cultural wound. The Pacific lamprey has declined by an estimated 90% or more in many of its historical river systems, driven by the same combination of dams, degraded habitat, and altered water temperature and flow that affects lampreys everywhere. Tribal nations have been instrumental in pushing for recovery programs, contributing traditional ecological knowledge to management planning and participating actively in monitoring and restoration work. It is, in some ways, one of the more hopeful stories in lamprey conservation, a partnership between scientific and traditional knowledge systems, both oriented toward the same goal of returning a species to rivers that have been impoverished by its absence. Part 7. My final thoughts. Come back now to that river. Come back to the cold, dark stretch of water where we began, to the creature wriggling free of the silt after years of stillness. We know now what that movement means. We know the long patience of the amacoet years, the filters quietly working in the sediment, the years of slow accumulation in water that may have seemed, to any casual observer, devoid of life. We know the extraordinary drama of metamorphosis, the body taken apart and rebuilt, the eyes surfacing into light, the disc forming where no mouth had been. We know the open water, the parasitic feeding, the journey across seas or vast inland waters guided by chemical memories laid down before the animal could even see. And we know the final migration, the return, exhausted and dissolving from the inside to the gravel where everything began. What strikes me, thinking about the lamprey's life in its entirety, is how completely it defies the categories we tend to use when we think about animals. We expect creatures to be either ancient or sophisticated, either simple or ecologically important, either frightening or worth protecting. The lamprey refuses all of these either-ors. It is ancient and biochemically sophisticated. It is anatomically simple and ecologically critical. It is to many people genuinely unsettling to look at, and it is also unambiguously worth every effort we can make to protect it. There is something profound in the fact that an animal whose body plan was finalized before the first fish had a jaw, before the first amphibian dragged itself onto land, before a single dinosaur had ever lived, that this animal is still here, that it is swimming right now, in rivers on multiple continents, that it is still building redds in gravel beds and filtering organic matter from stream water and delivering marine nutrients to the headwaters of rivers that would be measurably poorer without it. The lamprey survived not by dominating, not by outcompeting everything around it, but by being precisely and consistently what it is. It found its niche, the deep sediment of clean rivers, the flanks of large fish, the chemical messages written in flowing water, and it filled that niche with an efficiency that has made it functionally immune to evolutionary obsolescence. While entire lineages came and went, while the world rearranged itself through continental drift and mass extinction, and the rise and fall of countless ecosystems, the lamprey just kept being the lamprey. In an era when we are losing species faster than we can document them, when rivers are being transformed beyond recognition and the complex ecological networks they support are unraveling strand by strand, there is something important in that persistence. Not a lesson, exactly. Nature does not offer lessons so much as facts, but a reminder that the most ancient things, the most unexpected things, the things that strike us as alien or disturbing or difficult to love, are often the things that have kept the world running all along. The lamprey does not need us to love it, but it needs us to understand it, and it needs us to act on that understanding, to remove the barriers from its rivers, to protect the clean gravel of its spawning beds, to leave the headwater streams undisturbed, to recognize that a river without lampreys is a river that has lost something irreplaceable. That creature, wriggling free of the silt and beginning its upstream journey, carries within it 500 million years of unbroken continuity. It carries the shape of the world's first vertebrates. It carries, in its body's chemistry and its navigational memory, a story longer than almost anything else alive on this planet. It is not a monster. It is not a relic. It is not simply a parasite or an invasive species or a curiosity from the deep past. It is a lamprey, and it is, in every sense that matters, one of the most extraordinary animals that has ever lived. If you enjoyed this episode of Animal Uncovered, following the podcast is the best way to support the show. And if there's an animal you want us to uncover next, leave a review or comment and let us know. Until next time.